Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country.
For 73 seconds, it looked like America was winning again. The sky over Cape Canaveral was clear. The crowds were cheering. Classrooms across the country had their television switched on. Children leaning forward in their seats, watching a schoolteacher prepare to become the first civilian to orbit the Earth. It was supposed to be a triumph. It was supposed to be history. Then it wasn't. The Space Shuttle Challenger tore itself apart on the morning of January 28, 1986, killing all 7 people on board and burning itself into the national memory as one of the most shocking disasters in American history. Most people know the broad strokes, the cold, the O-ring, the fireball. But the full story is so much darker, so much more complicated, and so much more disturbing than the version taught in textbooks. Because here's what you probably didn't know. The disaster wasn't a surprise. Not to the engineers who built the shuttle. Not to the man who sent a written warning 6 months before the launch. Not even to NASA itself, which had logged dozens of anomalies, erosions, and near misses in the years leading up to that morning, and launched anyway. And the crew. There's a deeply unsettling truth about what happened to them after the shuttle broke apart that NASA buried for years. This is the Challenger disaster you didn't know about. Stay with me. To understand why Challenger happened, you have to go back to the early 1970s, when NASA was riding high on the legacy of the Apollo program and completely unsure of what came next. The moon landings had been genuinely astonishing, possibly the most extraordinary achievement in human history. But by 1972, they were also becoming politically inconvenient. Congress was growing restless with the enormous price tag. The public, as captivating as moonwalks were to watch, was beginning to look for the next thing. And NASA, suddenly stripped of its greatest mission, needed a new reason to exist. The answer was the Space Shuttle, a reusable spacecraft that would operate more like a commercial airline than a one-shot rocket. The pitch to Congress was seductive. Rather than building a new vehicle for every mission and watching it burn up or splash into the ocean, NASA would fly the same orbiter again and again, potentially up to 24 times a year. The shuttle would carry satellites, support military missions, deploy scientific payloads, and bring everything back safely. The cost per flight, the agency argued, would drop dramatically over time. It was a bold vision. It was also, as engineers would later acknowledge, a vision that was shaped as much by political survival as by engineering reality. To secure congressional approval, NASA made promises it couldn't realistically keep. It overstated the potential launch frequency. It understated the cost and complexity of refurbishing the orbiter between flights. And when budget constraints began to bite, as they inevitably did, the agency started making compromises that would eventually prove fatal. The most consequential of those compromises involved the solid rocket boosters. Every shuttle launch required 2 enormous solid rocket boosters, or SRBs, strapped to the sides of the external fuel tank. They provided the majority of the thrust at liftoff and separated from the orbiter about 2 minutes into flight, parachuting into the ocean to be recovered and reused. The safest option, liquid-fueled boosters, was rejected early in the design process. Liquid boosters were more expensive, more complex, and would have required significantly more development time. Instead, NASA awarded the contract for solid boosters to Morton Thiokol, a Utah-based aerospace contractor with strong political connections. Solid boosters are simpler in some ways, but they carry a critical limitation that liquid boosters do not. Once ignited, they cannot be shut down. There's no abort option once those motors are lit. The crew is committed entirely and immediately from the moment of ignition. And here's the design detail that ultimately killed the Challenger crew. Because Morton Thiokol's factory in Utah couldn't build the boosters as a single seamless cylinder and transport them to Florida intact, the SRBs were manufactured in segments and assembled at Kennedy Space Center. The segments were joined together with field joints, connection points sealed with rubber gaskets known as O-rings. 2 O-rings per joint, a primary and a backup. The rings were meant to expand under heat during ignition, creating an airtight seal that would prevent the superheated combustion gases inside the motor from escaping. It was a solution born of logistics and budget constraints. And it came with a fatal flaw. O-rings are made of rubber. Rubber becomes stiff and loses its flexibility in cold temperatures. A stiff O-ring doesn't expand the way it's supposed to, and an O-ring that doesn't expand properly cannot seal a joint, which means hot gas can escape. And if hot gas escapes from a solid rocket motor burning at several thousand degrees, it will cut through whatever is in its path: aluminum skin, fuel tanks, human beings, with the precision of a blowtorch. Engineers at Morton Thiokol knew this. The question is why nobody with the power to ground the shuttle acted on it. Roger Boyschley was a senior structural engineer at Morton Thiokol, and by 1985, he was genuinely frightened. He had spent months studying the post-flight analysis data from previous shuttle missions, and what he was finding was not reassuring. Multiple flights had shown evidence of O-ring erosion. The rubber seals were being partially burned through by hot combustion gases. In several instances, only the secondary O-ring had saved the mission from catastrophic failure. The primary seal had been compromised. The backup had been the only thing standing between the crew and disaster. In January 1985, after examining the solid rocket boosters recovered from Mission 51C, a shuttle flight that had launched in cold temperatures, Boyschley found the most severe O-ring damage yet recorded. The erosion was far worse at lower temperatures. The correlation was undeniable. The colder the launch day, the more the rubber stiffened, the worse the sealing, the greater the damage. On July 31, 1985, 6 months before Challenger's final flight, Boyschley wrote a memo to his superiors at Morton Thiokol. His language was not ambiguous. He warned explicitly of the possibility of structural failure during flight and described what he believed the outcome would be: the loss of human life. He urged immediate action. He recommended design changes. He asked for cold temperature testing of the seals. The memo circulated internally at Thiokol. It did not lead to any grounding of the shuttle fleet. It did not trigger a design review. The answer, essentially, was noted, but we're not stopping the launches. Why? Because schedule had become king. NASA had promised 24 flights per year. It had commercial clients waiting. It had military payloads scheduled. It had international commitments. Each delay was an embarrassment, financially, politically, and reputationally. And so a system developed, quietly and gradually, in which the burden of proof was reversed. Engineers were no longer asked to prove that launching was safe. They were asked to prove that it was unsafe, and to provide the kind of definitive, irrefutable data that, in an inherently uncertain engineering environment, is almost impossible to produce. This is the dynamic that sociologist Diane Vaughan would later term the normalization of deviance, a process by which repeated anomalies, each surviving without immediate catastrophe, become absorbed into the routine. The O-ring erosion wasn't fixed. It was reclassified. It stopped being a red flag and became a known issue. And known issues, in the institutional logic of a schedule-driven organization, are something you manage, not something you stop for. By January 27, 1986, the night before Challenger's final launch, a cold front was moving through central Florida. Temperatures at Kennedy Space Center were expected to drop well below freezing overnight. The predicted temperature at launch time the following morning was around 28 to 29 degrees Fahrenheit. For reference, the coldest previous shuttle launch had occurred at 53 degrees Fahrenheit, and even that flight had shown O-ring damage. The engineers at Morton Thiokol were alarmed. Led by Boyschley and his colleague Arnie Thompson, they convened a teleconference with NASA managers that evening and argued strenuously against launching. They presented charts. They showed the correlation between temperature and O-ring erosion. They made the case that the conditions the following morning were outside any tested range, and that the risk of catastrophic seal failure was unacceptably high. Initially, Thiokol's management supported them. The company recommended against launch. Then NASA pushed back. One senior manager reportedly asked whether Thiokol was asking NASA to wait until April before flying again. The implication was clear. The objection was inconvenient. The pressure was palpable. And in a moment that has since become one of the most studied examples of institutional failure in modern history, Thiokol management asked the engineers to go off the line while they huddled privately. When they returned, they had reversed their recommendation. In a phrase that has echoed through engineering ethics courses ever since, A Thiokol vice president reportedly told the engineers to put on their management hats and think about the decision differently. The objection was withdrawn. NASA was given the green light. Roger boisterously went home that night, convinced that people were going to die in the morning. He was right. At 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time on January 28, 1986, Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Launch Complex 39B at Kennedy Space Center. The weather was cold. Temperatures had dipped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, and by launch time, ice had formed on the launch structure itself. NASA ice teams had been monitoring conditions since the early hours of the morning. 1 second after ignition, just 1 second, high-speed cameras captured a puff of dark smoke near the lower field joint of the right solid rocket booster. The O-ring had failed almost immediately. Hot combustion gas was escaping through the joint. Temporarily, a miracle of sorts occurred. A fragment of combustion byproduct, charred debris from inside the motor, lodged in the breech and plugged the leak. For the next 60 seconds or so, Challenger flew normally. The crew would have felt nothing unusual. Telemetry data flowing to mission control looked routine. From the ground, the launch looked textbook. At around 37 seconds, the shuttle passed through a region of high wind shear, gusts that rocked the vehicle and stressed the already compromised joint. The temporary debris plug held. Barely. At 59 seconds, Challenger reached max Q, the moment of maximum aerodynamic pressure, when the combination of speed and atmospheric density places the greatest physical stress on the vehicle. The shuttle throttled through it. The plug still held. At 64 seconds, it didn't hold anymore. The debris blew out. A bright, unmistakable plume of flame appeared at the lower attachment point of the right booster, the exact location where the O-ring had failed. The flame was roughly 2,900 degrees Fahrenheit. It burned sideways. It was aimed directly at the external fuel tank, which contained hundreds of thousands of gallons of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen under high pressure. Within seconds, the flame had burned through the aluminum wall of the hydrogen tank. Structural failure followed almost immediately. The bottom strut connecting the right booster to the external tank gave way. The booster pivoted, rotating into the tank. The aerodynamic forces on the vehicle, traveling at nearly Mach 2, completed the destruction. At 73 seconds after launch, the external tank ruptured catastrophically. The liquid propellants, hydrogen and oxygen, the most energetically reactive combination that exists, mixed and ignited in an enormous, uncontrolled release of energy. The shuttle did not explode, in the traditional cinematic sense. There was no single detonation. What happened was structural disintegration. The orbiter was torn apart by aerodynamic forces as it was exposed to hypersonic airflow without its external tank for structural support. The two solid rocket boosters, still burning, continued flying on diverging trajectories, one even executing a full loop, until range safety officers activated their built-in destruct systems and destroyed them remotely. From the ground, millions of people watching live, including thousands of schoolchildren in classrooms across the country, saw a fireball and a branching Y-shaped plume of smoke where Challenger had been. The last words from the crew came at 73 seconds, just before the breakup. Commander Dick Scobie had just acknowledged an instruction for mission control to throttle up the engines. Roger, go at throttle up. Then silence. Then the voice of Flight Director Jay Green. Flight controllers here are looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. It was the understatement of the decade. Here's the part of the Challenger story that most official accounts soften, and that no school textbook captures fully. The crew did not die when the shuttle broke apart. At least some of them did not. When Challenger disintegrated at 73 seconds, the orbiter's forward crew cabin, a heavily reinforced structure located at the nose of the vehicle, separated largely intact from the rest of the wreckage. While the rest of the shuttle fragmented almost instantly, the crew cabin continued upward on a ballistic arc, reaching an altitude of approximately 65,000 feet before beginning a 2.5-minute freefall toward the Atlantic Ocean. 2.5 minutes. That is 150 seconds during which the cabin was falling from nearly 12 miles up with no power, no communication, no guidance, and no way to survive what was coming. The evidence that at least some crew members survived the initial breakup is well documented and was confirmed by the Rogers Commission, the independent presidential panel convened to investigate the disaster. Investigators found that 3 of the 7 personal egress air packs, small emergency devices that provide a few minutes of breathable air, had been manually activated. These are not automated systems. They cannot be triggered by impact or shock. They require a deliberate, conscious human action to turn on. The peeps belonging to mission specialists Ellison Onizuka and Judith Resnick, and pilot Michael Smith, had all been activated. Smith's pack was particularly telling. It was mounted behind his seat, in a location that would have been difficult for him to reach himself. According to testimony reviewed by the Rogers Commission, it was likely activated by another crew member, possibly Onizuka or Resnick, who leaned across to help him. What does this tell us? It tells us that in the seconds after the shuttle broke apart, at least 2 or 3 people were sufficiently conscious and aware to reach for emergency equipment. They knew something was catastrophically wrong. They were doing what they had been trained to do. The cabin fell for approximately 2.5 minutes. At altitude, the thin atmosphere and probable rapid depressurization of the cabin would have caused hypoxia, oxygen deprivation, within a matter of seconds. According to Dr. Joseph Kerwin, a NASA physician who led the investigation into crew survivability, the astronauts were likely unconscious before they hit the water, though the damage from the 200-mile-per-hour ocean impact made it impossible to determine the exact rate of depressurization. The cabin struck the Atlantic at a force entirely incompatible with human survival. All 7 crew members were confirmed to have been in their seats, still strapped in, when the wreckage was recovered by Navy divers on March 7, 1986, 6 weeks after the disaster. NASA withheld these details initially. The agency released the Kerwin report only after sustained pressure from journalists and members of Congress. Even today, the agency has never made a definitive public statement about exactly how long, or to what degree, the Challenger crew may have been conscious during their final descent. It is, perhaps, the most uncomfortable truth of the entire disaster, that the outcome for those 7 people was not instantaneous, not painless, and not inevitable. If the O-rings had held, if the launch had been postponed by a single day, as temperatures were forecast to rise, if Roger Boisjoli's memo had been acted upon in July 1985, any one of those things could have saved them. When President Ronald Reagan convened the Rogers Commission to investigate the disaster, he assembled an impressive group. Former Secretary of State William Rogers as chairman, astronauts Neil Armstrong and Sally Ride, test pilot Chuck Yeager, and, somewhat reluctantly, Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman. Feynman was an unusual choice in some ways. He was a theoretical physicist, not an aerospace engineer. He was also famously impatient with bureaucratic obfuscation and institutional nonsense. Those qualities turned out to be exactly what the investigation needed. While the commission proceeded through its formal hearings in Washington, Feynman went rogue. He went directly to the engineers, not the managers, not the PR people, but the actual people who built and maintained the shuttle. He asked them blunt questions. He solicited their honest assessments. And what he heard, again and again, was that the gap between what engineers believed about the shuttle's safety and what managers were telling decision-makers was vast. He discovered that NASA managers had estimated the probability of a catastrophic failure on any given shuttle launch at approximately 1 in 100,000. The engineers' own estimates, based on their actual data and experience, placed a figure somewhere between 1 in 50 and 1 in 200. Those 2 numbers are not a minor discrepancy. They represent completely different risk universes. If you genuinely believe the risk of catastrophic failure was 1 in 100,000, you might accept the risk. If you believed it was 1 in 50, which would mean a roughly 50% probability of losing a shuttle within 35 flights, no rational person would accept it. The gap between those numbers was the gap between the culture of management and the reality of engineering. And it was, Feynman concluded, a gap that had been deliberately maintained by people who needed launches to proceed on schedule. Then came the moment that made television history. During a televised hearing of the Rogers Commission on February 11, 1986, just 2 weeks after the disaster, Feynman reached across the table, picked up a piece of O-ring rubber that he had acquired at a hardware store, placed it in a glass of ice water, squeezed it with a C-clamp to simulate launch conditions, and let it sit. Then he removed it, released a clamp, and showed it to the cameras. The rubber did not spring back. It stayed compressed. It had lost its elasticity entirely. "I believe this has some significance for our problem," he said, one of the great understatements in scientific communication. The demonstration took less than 30 seconds. It demolished NASA's technical defense in real time, on live television. The cause of the Challenger disaster had just been demonstrated with a hardware store clamp and a glass of water. But Feynman wasn't satisfied with the technical finding alone. He went further. He insisted on writing his own independent appendix to the Rogers Commission report, an unusual step that the Commission's chairman reportedly tried to discourage. In it, Feynman laid out his broader critique of NASA's safety culture with characteristic directness. He wrote that NASA management appeared to be engaged in a kind of Russian roulette, accepting known risks, getting away with them, and then treating survival as evidence of safety rather than as evidence of luck. He concluded with a sentence that has since become one of the most quoted observations in the history of aerospace engineering. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. The Rogers Commission's final report, published in June 1986, was damning in ways that went far beyond the O-rings. Yes, the immediate physical cause of the disaster was the failure of the O-ring seal in the right solid rocket booster's lower field joint, as a direct result of the cold temperatures on launch morning. That finding was unambiguous, but the Commission went further, identifying the organizational culture at NASA as a contributing cause in its own right. The report found that concerns about the O-rings had been raised as early as 1977, 9 years before the Challenger disaster. Post-flight data showing O-ring erosion had been documented on multiple flights dating back to 1981. NASA had classified the O-ring joint as a Criticality 1 item, meaning that its failure would result in loss of vehicle and crew, and yet had issued a waiver allowing flights to continue despite the known erosion problem. The Commission found that information about the O-ring problems was not being communicated to senior NASA leadership. The people making decisions about whether to launch were not receiving the full picture of what engineers on the ground were seeing in the data. Whether this was the result of deliberate filtering or systemic dysfunction, the outcome was the same. Decision-makers were operating in the dark. The report also pointed specifically to the culture at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, which oversaw the solid rocket booster program, as one in which engineers were discouraged from raising safety concerns through official channels. Dissent was not rewarded. Bad news was managed rather than elevated. The Rogers Commission found this pattern deeply problematic. What the Commission described, in essence, was an institution that had prioritized schedule, budget, and public image over engineering reality, and had developed, over years, a set of institutional habits that made it possible to ignore warning signs that should have grounded the shuttle long before January 28, 1986. The Challenger disaster grounded the shuttle fleet for 32 months. During that time, NASA undertook a comprehensive redesign of the solid rocket booster field joints, adding a third O-ring, installing joint heaters to counteract cold temperatures, and redesigning the Tang-and-Clevis interface. The return to flight came on September 29, 1988, when Discovery lifted off on mission STS-26 using the first pair of redesigned boosters. The institutional changes were significant too, at least initially. NASA established a new safety oversight structure, created an independent safety advisory panel, and revised its launch commit criteria to make it harder to override engineer objections. Roger Boisterly, who had tried so hard